Today, in history, Seoul AM, June 25, 1950. A Sunday. The Korean peninsula is still dark. Rain hammers the 38th parallel, the invisible line drawn 5 years earlier to split a nation in two. On the northern side, engines are rumbling. Hundreds of them. Soviet-built T-34 tanks are already rolling south. The soldiers inside have been told this will be over in 3 days. The Republic of Korea had an army. On paper. In reality, it was under-equipped, under-trained, and spread thin. Most soldiers were asleep. Their commanders had received intelligence warnings for weeks. Washington had read the cables. Nobody moved. Nobody believed Kim Il-sung would actually do it. Kim Il-sung had been planning this for 18 months. He flew to Moscow twice. He sat across from Stalin himself and begged for permission to strike. Stalin finally said yes, but made one thing clear. If this goes wrong, the Soviet Union was never here. At 4 a.m. exactly, 135,000 North Korean troops crossed the 38th parallel simultaneously along 6 invasion corridors. Artillery opened up first, a wall of sound that ripped the silence apart. South Korean border posts didn't just fall. They evaporated. Seoul, a city of 1 million people, was only 35 miles from the border. The capital of South Korea had almost no time. Within hours, panicked radio broadcasts were going out. Within hours, families were grabbing whatever they could carry and running south. In Washington, D.C., it was still Saturday night, June 24th. Harry Truman was at his home in Missouri when the call came in from Secretary of State Dean Acheson. The words were simple and devastating. The North Koreans have invaded. Truman later wrote in his diary, he knew, right then, that this could be the start of World War. Truman flew back to Washington the next morning. In a meeting that lasted just 90 minutes, he made one of the most consequential decisions of the 20th century. The United States would fight. Not because Korea was strategically vital, because if they didn't, every American ally on Earth would stop believing in American protection. The United Nations Security Council met in emergency session, and here's where history turned on a knife's edge. The Soviet Union should have been in that room with a veto. They weren't. They were boycotting the UN over an unrelated dispute with China. Their empty chair would cost them dearly. Within 72 hours, Seoul fell. The South Korean army collapsed so fast that its own commanders blew up the Han River Bridge, while thousands of civilian refugees were still crossing it. Over 800 people died in seconds. It was a catastrophe disguised as a military decision. The first American troops arrived from Japan with almost nothing. Light weapons, no anti-tank rounds that could stop a T-34. Task Force Smith, 540 men, was sent to slow down an army of 135,000. They weren't expected to win. They were expected to die slowly enough to buy time. Task Force Smith met the enemy on July 5th. Their weapons bounced off the T-34s. They held for 7 hours before their lines broke. They ran. Some were captured. Some were never found. It was America's first ground engagement of the Korean War, and it was a disaster. But it delayed the North Korean advance just long enough. The war that followed was 3 years of brutal back and forth. MacArthur's Incheon landing turned the tide. Then China entered and pushed the United Nations forces back. Then a stalemate. Then negotiations that dragged on for 2 more years while men kept dying over hills that had no names. The Armistice was signed on July 27, 1953. Not a peace treaty, an armistice. A ceasefire. The two Koreas remain technically at war to this day. The 38th parallel is still there. The DMZ is still the most heavily militarized border on Earth. Nothing was resolved. Everything was frozen. 36,000 Americans died. 137,000 were wounded. Hundreds of thousands of South Korean soldiers fell. Millions of Korean civilians, north and south, were killed, displaced, or never seen again. And in the United States, the war was barely spoken about. Sandwiched between World War II and Vietnam, it became known as the Forgotten War. But here's what the history books miss. June 25, 1950 didn't just start a war. It redrew the entire Cold War map. It proved the United States would fight communism anywhere on Earth. It locked in the military alliance system that defines global politics to this day. One rainy Sunday morning, 135,000 soldiers crossing an invisible line, and the world was never the same. So tell me, if the Soviets hadn't boycotted the UN that day, do you think the Korean War ends differently? Drop your answer in the comments.